All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rojas Report. First thing I want to do is let everybody know who's joining live. First of all, thank you for joining live. But let me know if you can hear me okay or if we have any audio issues, because this is the second time I'm doing a live audio and I want to make sure that it works all right. So, any feedback, of course, if you're joining live, you have the advantage of being able to ask questions, share comments while we are doing the show. And of course, I'll be able to answer those questions and share your comments and talk about those. And that makes it a lot of fun. Those who can watch live are the intergalactic planetary patrons that join on Patreon. Otherwise, on Patreon, you can get for only $1.50 a month, which helps me keep doing this. You can get the audio for all of the shows. And the cool thing is if you're a podcaster, that's the pod people level, you are provided an RSS link that you plug that into your favorite podcast tool, and then it'll download the shows for you. It's the only way, really, if you're a podcast people patron, to get all the shows downloaded to your phone. You can also, of course, get that rate at Patreon. First, the video that we're recording now, you'll be able to watch those in YouTube archives if you're a subscriber there. So that's how that all works. All right. So the show today is very exciting. I've got Chris Mellon. Chris Mellon is an important character because he is part of To the Stars. He's part of the board of advisors, and he has an incredible background. He belongs to the Mellon family, so Mellon Banks, that's his family. He's a former United States Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence. And more importantly, for what we'll be talking about today, he formerly served as the staff director of the United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Why is that particular piece of news important? Because it is the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the SSCI, that recently, as part of the annual intelligence authorization bill, is requesting of many military intelligence agencies that they provide UAP or UFO reports. Pretty extraordinary. In this request, they actually call out an organization called the UAP Task Force. And they indicate by this request that, this is a task force made up of many agencies and military organizations. I'm just kind of laughing right now because I just noticed in my background I have kind of a mess. I've had some guests this week, and I guess I didn't clean up my set. Forgot to do that. Sorry about that. Plus, I'm busy putting together some stories related to this interview that I'm about to share with all of you right now. Let's see some other information that will be important before we get into this. It's just, I guess, some of the other characters, if you're not aware. So, for example, we'll be referring to Lou Elizondo quite a bit. Lou Elizondo used to work for the Pentagon and the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program called ATIP. He was working in OSD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, as a intelligence officer there. He was working primarily on counterintelligence with terrorists, that sort of thing. But he was also working this kind of portfolio on UFO and research regarding military cases called ATIP. He also says there were others involved with that and that program continues, although the DoD has said funding for that program ran from 2007 to 2012 and that the program did not continue. However, this request by the Senate Committee on Intelligence demonstrates that committee or that group has continued and that UAP research goes on. The SSCI actually kind of called out the ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, to kind of coordinate this, and is kind of, calling them out or making it seem as they're kind of an overseer of this group, of which they are. And from what I understand, the reason it's not just OSD and now it's ONI that is kind of seeing things over is that many of these cases that have come forward and these witnesses, credible military witnesses that have been briefing the senators and Congress people and military leaders and others, our military are Navy witnesses, so Navy jet pilots, that sort of thing. Of course, if you've watched Histories Unidentified, you've seen many of this. If you follow my work, you'll know that there have been several articles throughout the last few years in the New York Times and Politico and Washington Post and all over the place covering all of these great cases and all the controversies that are surrounding them. And we will cover a couple of those with Chris Mellon. So this interview, I was only able to get audio, and it runs about 19 minutes. And some of the questions maybe you'll recognize because I did take a couple questions from my audience here, and especially my Patreon patrons. And in fact, I should give a shout out because one of the people who made all of this Senate Intelligence Committee news is Steve McDaniel, who is there in our chat group here live. And he actually found that report. And I should say it's kind of interesting. He just went into a government database, on the internet and looked for UAP information, and he found this request from the Senate Intelligence Committee. So then that got out there, and it's made news all over the place. So no problem, Steve. Of course, I'll mention you. Give credit. And also, Danny Silva actually saw Steve McDaniel write about this or tweet about it. He wrote up something, and that's actually what Politico saw. Brian Bender, who we interviewed last week, you might have caught that one. But that's what Brian Bender saw and why he wrote it, the Politico article that made this news all over the place. And of course, it is incredible news. And maybe if you're new to UFOs, it's going to be important to kind of understand that as well. I'm going to take these off. I'm getting an echo. That's why I keep stuttering here. But why is that news? Why is that so important? Well, since 1969, the U.S. Air Force and the rest of the government has said they don't have nor do they want anything to do with UFOs. In fact, even myself, covering stories and just doing research, or even as a field investigator for the Mutual UFO Network, when you call the FAA or the Air Force, they tell you, we're not really interested. We haven't cared about UFOs since 1969, and they send you a fact sheet that tells you all about Project Blue Book and why they don't regard UFOs as anything big. Even though through the last few decades, people like John Greenwald of the Black Vault have done FOIA requests, including myself and others, where we've uncovered documents that show there have been UFO incidents that have been taken seriously, but yet we go to the government to get more information and they say, no, we don't care about UFOs. So that has been, we've known, false. Unfortunately, the media hasn't really picked that up and ran with it. It's been considered more of a conspiracy theory. But now we know that since 2007, they have been interested in UFOs and they have been actively investigating those, and even having agencies or programs like ATIP that have been doing that. So essentially, we've been being lied to, surprise, surprise, all of this time. And so this is big news. And I guess I will let Chris get into some of the details as to why the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence has also felt that this is big news. So let's take a listen. Like I said, this is audio. I was only given permission to do an audio interview, which I'm more than happy to get, since that's all I have availability to. But and it's better than nothing. But let's listen in, and then we'll share kind of my analysis of what Chris is talking about, and we'll take some questions from those of you who are live in the chat and comments as well. So let me put my headphones back on. You're going to have to watch me while we listen here, but maybe I'll have some reactions that you might find interesting. All right, here we go. And in the chat, make sure and let me know if you can hear this all right. The first question is, when did you first discover ATIP?
Did I first discover it? I think I probably first learned about ATIP in 2017, I would guess. I don't recall precisely. I'd have to go back through calendars or something. I was not part of the program.
Mm-hmm. When you first started, when you first discovered them, and I guess started working with Luis Elizondo, were you able to join any of the meetings with their senior leadership?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What was that like? I know you've had a long time interest in this topic. Was it surprising that this organization existed?
Yeah, I was surprised because I was involved in, I had my hand in pretty much all the spooky stuff when I was there, and there didn't seem to be anything going on in this particular topic, and it was something that I had always been interested in. So I was surprised to see they had anything organized at all. But more than that, I was shocked that such little effort was being made, and to understand is that our Navy pilots were getting so little support. And so what I tried to do was introduce Lou to some very senior people in the department that I knew, that I had connections to, who were very close to the Secretary of Defense, to try to get this on the Secretary's radar. And, that's another story unto itself. But when that didn't pan out, ultimately, Lou faced the choice between essentially living with an inadequate program or throwing in the towel or going public to try to inform the public and Congress and help make something happen.
Which is essentially happened.
Yeah, we had a strategy from the outset and a plan. Before he even left, we discussed what that would look like, and we've been executing on it ever since.
Your help and kind of an unconventional way of going about things now with the Senate requesting these UAP reports, is this pretty much, do you feel vindication for Lou's efforts? Because he put a lot on the line.
Yeah, I do. I feel it's very gratifying. What motivated me to a great degree in Lou, I was outraged, just outraged that these military pilots were not getting more support, and that the intelligence community was completely unresponsive and completely dropping the ball. I mean, it could be Russian, it could be Chinese, it could be something else. Whatever it is, our pilots, if we have an intelligence community for a reason, partly to support our military, partly to avoid strategic surprise, and the intelligence community was failing on both counts, just flat out. And as a member of the intelligence community and somebody who cares about national security, I was appalled and determined to see if I could do something to help fix that problem. And so Lou and I were on the same page there. And it's worth noting that he did try it. I tried to help him to work through the system first. And some meetings were held and more briefings were held and so forth. But ultimately, it proved impossible to get this in front of the Secretary, and people were still afraid to touch it and afraid to let the Secretary even be exposed to the issue. They were afraid that even a mere briefing for him would somehow taint him or compromise his sterling reputation.
With the Senate Intelligence Committee asking for these reports, does this demonstrate, that they were essentially wrong, that there was much more credible interest than perhaps they were aware of?
Well, the Senate Intelligence Committee and some other committees, since this issue got some press attention, since our show Unidentified started, since the New York Times article appeared, my op-ed in the Washington Post with another video, and so forth, that first of all engaged the Navy and required the Navy to own up to the fact that this was real. They couldn't any longer deny it when they had active duty pilots and others going on the record. And that also then led to briefings for Congress, and ultimately this report requirement. The report requirement is a recognition that there is something going on with national security ramifications. It has it's a forcing function that hopefully will force the executive branch to get its act together and pool all the intelligence, regardless of which stovepipe it's in, which organization has it, and it establishes some accountability and forces them to take a position in black and white as opposed to just giving some briefings. Now they've actually got to take all the puzzle pieces they have, see if they can form a picture from them, and take a position on what that picture looks like and what should be done next. So it's a tremendous step forward, regardless of what the phenomenon turns out to be in the end. At least now we can have some faith that a serious effort is going to be made to pull and analyze the data, probably implement a new collection strategy in support of a validated requirement that didn't exist before. So it has a lot of potential ramifications, all of them positive.
On season 1 of Identified, you all brought witnesses to DC. You personally wrote a Hill article about the Senate making this sort of, or Congress making this sort of request, and you have on the TTSA website some recommended verbiage. How influential would you say TTSA has been on this effort by the Senate Intelligence Committee?
There's no doubt in my mind that that report requirement would not be in there, wouldn't exist if we had not been engaged in bringing witnesses forward and advocating this and writing about it and so forth. So it also, this is my old committee, right? I worked on that committee for over a decade. I still know people on the Hill, and so there are some people there who are still there from when I served, and because we work together and are friends, and I don't abuse the privilege, they were willing to take my phone calls and listen to what we had to say, and so I think it wouldn't have happened without us, but at the same time, it was largely just because the senators and staffers had been kept in the dark. So, once they got the information, I think that, sort of naturally led them to a place where they recognize that they need yet more information. There's some important unanswered questions here.
In season 2 of Unidentified, will we see you all working further with military leaders and lawmakers?
In season 2, you are going to see a lot of military personnel again, and you're going to see new accounts, new cases that have never been aired before, have never been seen or discussed, that are going to add to the picture that we provided in season 1. And I think they're going to add to the impetus and the need for Congress to be asking questions, and also will, I think, begin to underscore the kinds of things that or provide more reason to believe that a report of that nature should be able to produce some very interesting findings. So, for example, in season 2, we have a NORAD watch officer who tells a story, an event he participated in firsthand, in which NORAD was trying to intercept a UFO. This was all the way up to the 4-star level, and they were scrambling every jet they could get in the air. This officer served there for a limited period of time, and that was back in the 90s. But the fact that we now can demonstrate that incidents like that have occurred, and that our aerospace warning network has indeed picked up and tracked objects that do not behave like anything that we have in our inventory, really adds to the I think the logic of what we've been proposing, and to the hopefulness that such a report will indeed find a lot of information that needs to be assessed.
What is your sense of how motivated some of the members of Congress are to get answers? So, for instance, if for some reason this report request doesn't finally make it into the final bill, do you think they'll pursue other avenues?
Yeah, I would expect that the report requirement will survive, first of all, although it might be modified to some degree. The level of interest varies, of course, among members, but I think there is sufficient interest among the chairman and vice chairman and some other key members that they will not be easily dissuaded from getting to the bottom of this one way or another.
In your suggested verbiage for this request, you had stated that you felt that the classification should sit wherever essentially the executive branch felt it should be at. But with this request that's out by the Senate Intelligence Committee, they're asking for a public portion. How significant is that?
Well, I was very pleasantly surprised to see that they did that. I didn't anticipate that. I think it's a good thing, and I know that that's an issue that some of the people who are looking at this language in the executive branch are uncomfortable with. Most of those folks are just not used to doing anything at an unclassified level, and some of them are saying, we can't do that or whatever. I don't think that's accurate. It's just that those particular individuals don't have much experience in that area. But the fact is, the Director of National Intelligence testifies in an open committee session every year on the greatest threats facing the United States. And he goes down, a whole laundry list of things like weapons of mass destruction, China, cyber threats, and all of that is written by intelligence community personnel who are experts in those topics and have access to virtually all of the most highly classified information on those subjects, and they're able to render it down to an unclassified level. So there's no reason why these folks couldn't also produce an unclassified report, but whether they will, the committee will continue to insist on that or not, I don't know. I think there'll be some discussion back and forth on that. I don't know how it'll come out.
What do you expect to see or hope to see in these reports?
Well, I just don't want to try to anticipate the outcome much. I think the most important thing is that they have a process with integrity and a process that really effectively surfaces all the relevant, pertinent information that resides in so many independent locations, from Army, Navy, Air Force, multiple intelligence agencies, FBI, and so forth. So if they follow the kind of rigorous process that is used to prepare national intelligence estimates, for example, which is quite thorough and systematic, then at the end of the day, we should get an assessment that is fair and balanced and based on empirical data, as well as pilot reports. And, you know, that's probably the best we can hope for.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier how you worked on the Senate Intelligence Committee. You were the staff director, and you worked, when you did that, with Senator John D. Rockefeller, whose uncle is famous for having Lawrence Rockefeller, for having an interest in UFOs and also working with the Clinton administration. Were you aware of that back then, and did this influence your interest as well?
I was not really aware of that. We never discussed it, never came up, and had no impact on anything.
In the Intelligence Committee's report request, they call out in particular the FBI, but we really haven't heard from the Air Force since all of this, not very much from the Air Force since all this news has come out. So why is the FBI called out, not the Air Force or maybe even the CIA?
Well, they call out the, you know, all the different, not all of them, but they call out the major intelligence disciplines. The Air Force and services are deemed to be covered by the language that's there. The FBI, many people don't realize that it's more than a law enforcement organization. It's also an intelligence organization, and they have a mission that's independent of law enforcement, which incidentally was an issue with regard to General Flynn, because the administration was making the case that they didn't have a legitimate law enforcement reason for those interviews, seeming to ignore the fact that the FBI has another role and mission that's very important, which exists beyond that. So I think they wanted to make sure that the FBI was going to be included and participate.
So this is a question from some of my listeners. They, several of them asked this question along these lines, and I think it stems from Lou Elizondo saying on Fox News that he believes that there could be, the government could have a piece of a crashed UFO, essentially. They're asking, do you believe that to be the case? Do you think that they've been able to retrieve some sort of material?
You know, that's a possibility. It's a possibility. We'll have to see.
Are there particular people in Congress that you have been working with who seem to have a higher interest than others?
There are some, certainly, but I don't care to identify anybody.
But I think that's really the extent of my questions for now.
Okay.
Thanks for all of the great information that you've been sharing, and you've been really out there being very open with the public about this, and it's been very enlightening.
Well, thank you very much, Alejandro. It's a pleasure, and I appreciate your interest very much.
All right. So that's the interview. I might go off screen for a second as I change my mic settings real quick. All right. So, Acupunk, you say that was ripe for a follow-up, and I would love to hear what you mean by that when you have a chance, and we'll talk about it. But please do share your comments, and I'm going to go through some of the notes here that I took that I thought was kind of interesting about what he said. And some of these you might recognize as your own questions. So the first thing that I felt was significant and interesting, I felt he shared so much, and he said a lot of great stuff. So let's see, just to verify, the SecDef, the Secretary of Defense, at the time of the failed attempt to get on the schedule was Mattis. Yes, that is correct. It was Mattis, someone who Lou Elizondo had served with and knew, but he still couldn't get that information up to him, which is interesting. We'll talk about that a little more too here in a second. But I thought Chris Mellon's response for kind of his drive was really interesting. When he found out about ATIP, he felt he was surprised there was very little effort to look into the UAP issue, and he was very concerned. He even used the term outraged that there was no support for Navy pilots who were experiencing UFOs, and he said that the intelligence community had completely dropped the ball. And I think he's 100% correct. What's really been strange about the last few decades, before the New York Times revealed the ATIP, was this claim that they're not interested in UFOs and that they were not taking public reports on UFOs, which seems to be completely ignorant, for lack of another term. It seems, that they would completely not be doing their job in keeping people safe. I mean, why wouldn't you want to take reports of something in the sky that is not identified, that doesn't appear to be ours, and follow up on that to make sure there are no incursions by foreign, technology? And I think it's really interesting that it just makes complete sense that this is something that Chris Mellon would be upset about, because it's something, I think it's strange that every citizen was not upset about. Instead, this taboo worked to kind of have the public blinded to this issue that, the military is not caring about strange things in the sky. Really, really weird. So I think that's great that Chris had that perspective. Also of interest is that Chris helped his best to get Lou Elizondo two senior people in the government. He didn't specifically say what senior people, but essentially he was trying to help Lou get the information up the line to Mattis. And Lou Elizondo shared with me privately, or not privately, publicly, in other interviews and with other people who have interviewed him, that that's what he tried to do, that he did try to get that information up the ladder, but no one was taking it seriously. In fact, Chris Mellon said that Lou Elizondo was kind of left in this position when they failed to be able to get this information up the line, that he would either have to quit, have to just live with this inadequate, kind of program where he was essentially muted and couldn't get this important, what he felt was vital intelligence up the line, or he would need to go public, which is a strategy that he and Chris kind of worked on together. And I think that there's an interesting part to that strategy too. But it's interesting that, the Secretary of Defense, who Adam, just pointed out, was General Mattis. They were afraid that he would be exposed, or that his reputation would be tainted if he had any sort of, briefing on this matter, which just shows, that the power of this taboo. And the reason I asked, is Lou now vindicated? Because Lou did leave the government. He and Chris came up with a strategy to get this public, which worked, which got the attention of eventually the Senate, and the Senate saying, hey, why are you keeping us in the dark? Essentially, they're saying Lou was right. You should have allowed Lou to get this information up the chain of command, and we should have been briefed on this information in the past. So that's really interesting. Another interesting thing is that he said they had a strategy before Lou left. So they worked on a strategy before. That's not too surprising. No, not many people I've seen touched on this. I think one of the few areas that this has been, touched upon, I feel, is my interview with Brian Bender of Politico. And he had shared that Lou and Chris had approached him and had shown some information to him about ATIP so that he could break the story. Eventually, they went with Leslie Kean in the New York Times, not just Leslie Kean, but Ralph Blumenthal and Helene Cooper with the New York Times. It was a bigger paper, essentially. And Brian Benner said he got it. He did not have any ill will. He didn't mind at all. And in fact, Brian Benner was still kind of he still is not as all in as people like Leslie Kean or Ralph Blumenthal, who have been really championing this topic for a long time. So, and of course, the New York Times being such a big venue for that story, it really broke it. But I think this answers some other questions. Some people have kind of questioned why To the Stars has not pursued, for instance, longer videos, more witness accounts. We do have quite a few witness accounts that they have gotten out there, but it seems that, and he sort of says this, and we'll see this more as we go down this list of things that he said, that really part of this strategy was to kind of put together this package of compelling information to get that out to the public, to get that into the media. And he even said it, that their goal was, let's see, where did he say it? To essentially to get the Navy to act. That once the information was out, that the Navy had to act on the situation, that their personnel were having these experiences, and by acknowledging that then allowed the process of what the Senate has done in requesting information, essentially by the Navy admitting that they take the situation seriously, that those cases that were revealed by the New York Times, provided to them by the Pentagon, essentially, potentially Lou Elizondo. They said they have other sources, but that forced essentially the Navy's hand. When they acknowledge that, then the Senate is alerted, hey, this is going on. We want to know more about this. And so they were able to get more information out. I think that's really interesting that they had this strategy, and that this strategy then was pushing out this product, this package of information they already had. So their interest wasn't necessarily on growing and getting more information. It was pushing this package they already had out and forcing that, forcing the Navy's hand, and then briefing the Senate to provide credible information that would get them to act. And it seems to have worked. So, yeah. Jim Stevens said, the credibility and methodical approach that Chris and TTSA is the best thing that has happened to this field. I think you're absolutely right. I think that it's just fascinating, where we are, and that the intelligence behind the strategy, first of all, but that what I've been saying lately, the expertise, and expertise do matter. And when it comes to this team, they all have their specific expertise. With Chris Mellon having worked with the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, he had an overview of all of the black projects, the SAP projects. And I do say SAP projects because there are more that potentially he didn't have access to. Those are called unacknowledged SAPs. That would have been an interesting question now that I think about it. Sorry, I'll ask that in my next interview. But he had an overview of pretty much the black projects because it was his job to brief the Senate and to provide them information on them. So he knew the game, he knew what had to happen, how, and he made it happen. So very, very interesting. Let's see a couple other things here that they kind of wanted. This also, by asking all of the things essentially this means, essentially, that this request is really important. He said that now this forces them to acknowledge and essentially to report on this and not just brief people. So thus far, I think as UFO people who are interested in this topic, and I'd love to hear what you guys think in the chat, people interested in this topic, we've been happy with just briefings. That the Senate's getting briefed on these cases is like, wow, that's really not happened to this degree before. Them taking it seriously and getting these briefings, and us watching it on television, on the Unidentified television show. We saw them taking some of these witnesses to Washington. That's pretty big. But what this request for reports does is a couple things. It makes them then establish an organized way of collecting information. And two, it makes them tell the public their stance. It makes them share with the public, essentially justify why they take UFOs seriously, and that they take UFOs seriously, and it makes them go on the record with this. And that's essentially what he's saying, that that's what it's forcing. It's forcing them to do this. As far as some of the people involved, and I think Adam, who's in here, we've talked about this before, and others, how strong is this interest by the Senate? And he sort of addressed that. He said that the chair and the vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee are not going to let this drop. He said that specifically. They won't let this drop. So they seem to be pretty motivated. And one of the pieces of their motivation, like he said, was that they were in the dark. They were left in the dark on this topic, and now they want answers. So that's really interesting. And he's expecting that we'll have some empirical data. So a couple other things here, and I'll look at some of your comments. I was a little embarrassed to ask the question, to be quite honest, about the crash debris. And I think one of you noticed the pregnant pause before he said it was possible. Is really interesting in that I just don't think he wanted to answer it. And I kind of qualified my question, or at least justified my question, by mentioning the Lou Elizondo interview with Fox News, because really I think that does make it fair of me to ask that question. And he paused. I don't know if that was a pause of a little bit of frustration that I would go there, or if it was because he was being careful with how he would word it. I kind of have a feeling, and I believe he's expressed before, he's never ran across anything that indicated to him that there was such a program, but he just put it very shortly that he didn't. It was possible, is what he said. As far as my last question, he also didn't answer, which is unfortunate. It would have been interesting to know what senators or congresspeople are most motivated to get answers, or most interested in this topic. But he didn't answer that question, although he did give us a clue earlier on by saying that the vice chair and the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee in particular were very interested in getting answered. He also is very clear here that this wouldn't have happened without To the Stars. And I think that's important, no doubt, because I think he's right. That's what's incredible about this situation that we're in. It's the right people at the right time to ask the right questions. And people like John Alexander, who I've interviewed recently on this topic, has always been saying, well, the UFO community has been asking the wrong questions. And we just don't have the insight of government insiders like John Alexander, who is an inspector general, a guy who, is there to enforce the rules and know the rules. And like he says, not many people know all the rules. There's a lot of training you have to go through to be an inspector general, to even understand the complicated inner workings of the bureaucracy and all the wild way that the government works with funding and everything. So I think that was really important as well. And if it wasn't for Chris Mellon, if it wasn't for a guy who has a strong interest in this topic, who really, I think, has a grounded perspective in that this is something that we need to take seriously, because we could have these, this foreign technology, flying willy-nilly in secured airspace, and we have nothing we can do about it. There absolutely should be a concern by someone somewhere. And now we're going to find out, hopefully, who has that concern where. I think what was interesting about the interview with John Alexander is he highlighted that, what are the interests of these agencies? And it always comes back to money, right? and funding is their major interest. So how will this affect their funding? And it's going to be a major consideration in how they go forward. But if you do listen to the TTSA talks, and I did try not to duplicate a lot of what Chris Mellon has talked about in the TTSA talks that he podcast that he did recently. He talks about how the Senate will have, and the Congress overall has the power of the purse. So they're the ones who have the purse strings. And so if these agencies want their money and they don't want to hurt their ability to get their funding, then they're going to be motivated to comply to requests such as this. And hopefully they don't fall prey to the kind of the taboo around UFOs, and that they do see that the mainstream is being very open to the idea, and that the Navy, I don't think, and maybe some of you can share if you feel differently, it doesn't seem like the Navy's approach at being very pro UFO, being very open about this matter, has had any negative reflect on them whatsoever. In fact, I would think that perhaps the DoD's stance, which has been to kind of fight Elizondo in particular tooth and nail, and to try to discredit his claims, although he's been able to substantiate, the credibility in all the claims over time, that they're the ones who really have more egg on their face than anybody regarding all of this. And then the Air Force has essentially not been here. The only thing we've seen of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, did do an investigation, and this is a law enforcement agency. They did investigate whether or not those F-18 videos were released properly, and whether Lou Elizondo in particularly did something wrong, skipped some steps, or did release classified information he wasn't privy to release. And although there was a mistake, they say, that was done, it was not by Lou Elizondo. That the Dopser group that essentially he submitted his request to release those videos, gave him permission to release those videos before they were completely declassified. But at the same time, the Air Force said they weren't classified in the first place. And they also said that in their report that they did, understand that ATIP did exist. It did research UFOs, and that Lou Elizondo was a part of this group, all things that the DoD has denied in the past. So important stuff as far as that goes as well. The other question I asked, which I thought was really interesting, is the Lawrence Rockefeller question, because I found it fascinating that when he was working for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, that he worked with Lawrence Rockefeller's nephew. And Lawrence Rockefeller was kind of a big deal in the UFO field, in that he funded a lot of UFO projects. He created a document that's called the Rockefeller document, which was what he felt were the best UFO cases. He printed 1,000 of those and dispersed those amongst different people in the government, or friends, or influential people, to influence them to try to do something about this topic, including the Clintons, which he worked with. And we have documents to show that he was asked to filter his UFO information through Hillary Clinton's office. There are photos of Hillary Clinton and Lawrence Rockefeller talking, and Hillary has like this book regarding extraterrestrial life, and it was a scientific book that postulated some different ideas. And so we know, and there are other groups such as Chris O'Brien on cattle mutilation research, Nancy Talbot, crop circle research, who Lawrence Rockefeller funded. But apparently Chris Mellon was not even aware of that didn't have any influence on his earlier interest in this field. Someone says, has anyone asked Chris Mellon when his interest in the topic started, or why? And that's a great question. And I should have followed up with that question, because I assumed that Lawrence Rockefeller had some sort of influence on him, and that he would kind of elaborate on the impetus of his interest. But unfortunately, I was not expecting that. Just nope, had nothing to do with it answer, which is kind of funny. Let's see. Let's see if we have any other questions from you guys. Adam says he was interested to hear him say he was pleasantly surprised by the insistence on an unclassified report, and that is interesting. I also found that interesting because in his suggestion he did say, that the report should be classified at whatever level the executive branch or the director of national intelligence felt was appropriate. And in the SSCI, the Senate Intelligence Committee report request, they did note that we realize a lot of this information is classified. However, we still want a public report. We want a public portion so we can share information with the public. So, that brings up 2 points. One, which is Chris is saying that's doable. That if some of these agencies are balking and saying, how are we going to share publicly information that's classified? Chris says that's doable, that the DNI has to testify every year, and that his staff have to create a public report on the SAP projects. So they're doing that on at least an annual basis. And who knows, it probably takes a long time to put together that report. So it is something they're used to doing, and it's doable. The second thing that he said regarding what he expects to see and what's in season 2 of Unidentified is that they've already revealed several cases, and that in the second season of Unidentified, they plan to show a lot more military cases. In fact, I've seen the first episode from a screener that I was provided by the History Channel, and they're great military cases that are covered in that first episode. But this is also kind of part of the strategy, it seems, in getting out these really good military cases so that, these agencies can't come back and say, well, we don't know nothing. We don't have any cases, when we've got these cases documented on a television show on the History Channel. So it's also part of kind of forcing people's hands to say, hey, not only are we asking you for reports, we already know there are plenty of reports there because we have credible witnesses that are on the record regarding some of these cases. Adam says, I'm sure he won't want to comment much, but it'd be fascinating to know the general TikTok behind this. How quickly did it come together? Did it mostly come together after Barr stepped down? I'm not sure. Or after Burr stepped down, I'm sorry. I would imagine my sense of things is that it's been moving steadily along ever since those briefings happened a year ago. And my sense, especially from this interview where essentially Chris Mellon says he called in some favors from some friends that he used to work with on the Senate Select Intelligence Committee, and to at least let them get briefed, that those briefings were highly effective. It probably took quite some time to do all of the briefings, I'm guessing, and that, sometimes briefings beget briefings for other interested parties, or, these parties wanting others to look at it so they can get an assessment from these third parties who they trust. So I would imagine it was kind of a long process already. So it doesn't surprise me that it would take a year for it to culminate into something like this. Personally, I could be wrong, but I would imagine that it's those regular processes. Wouldn't think that it would have to do a lot with some of these other individuals, but who knows? Who knows? It's a great question. It'll be interesting to find that out. Let's see. I wonder what would have, this is Acupunk. I wonder what would have happened if the offering had taken off. Would there be an actual research arm of TTSA? Oh, I see what you're saying. That is an interesting question. So, To the Stars has asked, of course, for funding from the public to buy shares in their public company. What is it? Public benefit company, they call it. It's kind of in between a company and a nonprofit that are supposed to work towards the public benefit. And Acupunk is essentially kind of suggesting here that that public offering didn't take off as much as they had hoped. And I think you're probably right. They have gotten a couple $1 million, but maybe not as much as they had hoped, especially because they keep asking for more and more funding. And if that funding had taken off, would there have been a research arm of To the Stars? Because we haven't seen a lot of research. We've seen them trying to get government contracts. And I kind of, called them out on clarifying that they were looking for government contracts, which I knew was the case, but I think they need to share this with their stakeholders. The reason why is they're trying to get contracts so they can fund the research side of things. So Acupunk is suggesting that they don't have the funding to do that sort of research. And I feel that you're right, that in the response to my proddings, they kind of said just that we can't afford the research until we get some of these other things going. But does that really work into the strategy that Chris Mellon had to get this information out? I don't think that was a primary concern necessarily. I kind of feel as though he had a package of information that he wanted to push forward, and that's what he's done. I think really all the rest of the stuff falls in after. So now what is going to happen? I think that also I will share this with you all. Let's see if there's any other question. Oh, by the way, Acupunk, you said that something was ripe for follow-up. I would love to know what you feel. He said the follow-up could have been to the pregnant pause before saying it was possible there was crashed materials. The follow-up could have been in Department of, was it in the DOE or private hands, or in the past did government possibly have material? I don't know if I agree with you, Acupunk, just because he said with the long pause and possible. Well, and I have a little bit of insight into previous comments that he's made, is that he gave me more than he's given in the past. In the past, he said he's not aware of anything like that. He's never seen any programs like that. So I don't think he, at this point, is aware of any projects where they've received crash material, even though others in TTSA feel differently. He certainly has expressed he doesn't necessarily agree that is the case. Michael Hester is asking, do you think new videos will be released soon from the Air Force, Navy, or another branch of the military? Here's what I think. I think that, and this is from my, conversations with some of these guys, I think that they are aware of a lot more material out there. And I think they are hoping that this request will help reveal more information. And that if it doesn't, then they are ready to prod and to help get that information out. I think that's what's important. We have people who are interested in getting this information out have a great advocate when it comes to all of these To the Stars guys, especially the people working on the government, and in particular Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon. And they have friends on the inside, so they're not necessarily alone pushing this information forward. So I think this group will continue to be advocates. Chris Mellon has also expressed in tweets that this isn't the end, this is just the beginning, that they're in for the long game, and that they're in to get a lot more information out and movement around all of this. So I think we certainly can be optimistic about the future of getting more information. And like I said, we've got some great champions in these guys to help get that information out. I have a feeling that this is only the beginning of their strategy, and that they hope to see a lot more information out. Does that mean, Michelle, did I say Michael? I'm so sorry. Michelle, does that mean there's videos from some of these other agencies? From what I've heard, yes. And I think that they are hopeful that these videos will come out. However, is it going to be so easy to pry these videos out? I'm not sure. We'll have to see. And Josh says they are doing a great job of making the subject okay to talk about publicly. That's for sure. I mean, when you have the Senate, and I think this is just a big story. The big story is Lou's story, and he's very humble. He's always, it's not about me, it's about all of us, it's about all of you. But this guy quits, obviously with a strategy with Chris Mellon to get information out, and he quits. And I think all of us interested in this topic can relate that he's inside. He's seeing, wow, this is credible. This is a big deal. This is the real deal. There's something to this, which is just like us. It's just like me covering this topic. When I'm in a group of journalists and I'm like, oh, and there's that science journalist who's like, oh, this is all BS. And I've got to be like, well, there actually is something. We've all been in that position where we're trying to champion our interest in our belief. And I think that, it's a substantiated belief that there's something credible to this phenomena. So you can only imagine the pushback that Lou would have gotten from many people when he's going and telling people, I need to get this to Mattis. People need to know that this is something important. And so then he quits his job over it, hoping to get this information out to the public. He joins his corporation with Tom DeLonge to the stars, and they're hoping to make this a viable profit-making company so they can do this research, but also earn a living. And none of that is for sure. All of that is shaky. Lou comes out. The DOD begins to deny everything that he's saying, essentially calling him a liar. I know for a fact there were people on the inside he thought were going to have his back that didn't. And fortunately, he had people like Chris Mellon and the To the Stars guys. The UFO community was not friendly to him. They bashed him a lot. And I can say that because they bashed me just for supporting him quite a bit and the group. So he got a lot of heat from the UFO community. That subsided, thankfully, especially as he's been proven right in many of his statements. And so finally, the television show, they get the show. It's great. Anthony Lappe, who I'll interview soon, the director of Unidentified, is just an excellent researcher and journalist. And I think has done a good job with bringing out credible information. So they get the show that helps things. They get movement behind the scenes, even though they're getting bashed. And Lou is getting bashed by the DOD. At the same time, he's working with military insiders and Congress people. How weird is that? And I know they're saying, guys, the DOD is saying this stuff, but you guys know I'm credible because you're working with me. How can this be happening? I know there are some researchers who have found out why that was happening. And hopefully there will be stories coming out as to what was going on there because it is weirdness. And I plan to write my own articles. And I think I have a line on a little bit of information that'll shed some clarity on all of that as well. But either way, I think if I put it all together in an article, it's kind of shocking, what sort of pushback he got from the DOD. That was unwarranted and untruthful. So, and now finally, the Senate, it's revealed the Senate Select Committee is asking for more information. They're concerned that they have been left in the dark, and they're concerned that the public has been left in the dark. The exact reasons Lou was trying to get that information up the chain of command, the exact reason he quit his job, putting his livelihood in jeopardy. He's also got a wife and children and dogs to take care of that he's responsible for, who are in college nonetheless, the kids, not the dogs. he's got all of these responsibilities that he's putting on the line for all of this, and the vindication of the Senate saying, hey, here it is. But they're not done. Now that this has happened, their plan is to provide more information and to kind of help steward this, what they hope to be this release of credible, substantiated information from all of these agencies. So they're hopeful. I can tell you that. And we've heard that from Chris. And I'll be interviewing Lou soon, hopefully next week. And guess what, guys? This will be a live stream. So you'll be able to join it to ask questions and make your comments with Lou right here live with me. So that'll be great. And then Anthony LePay, like I said, got an interview planned with him where we'll do the same thing, a live stream where you can ask your questions directly to all of these guys and share your comments. So not only is there reason to be optimistic about the future of the UFO topic, there is reason to be optimistic about the future of the Rojas Reports. So I'll be bringing you all of this great, credible information as it arises. And fortunately, I have a line in on some of the people, the direct people who are making this news. So I'll do my best. Some people are saying, you aren't charging enough. Thank you so much, Josh, because it's always been an issue for me to charge. But, it just comes down to, if I don't charge, I can't do this. And I went away for a little while, and a lot of you were really bummed about it. And I was bummed about it too. But, it was a moment where it was like, well, if I'm going to do this, many people want me to come back and do it, then I'm just going to have to charge for some of that information. And so that was kind of the logic. So I apologize if that disappoints any of you, but just know that, for $1.50 to get the audio version of this, it helps a lot. And then if you can go all the way up to it's not that much, but if you can go to the intergalactic planetary, Beastie Boys, I grew up with Beastie Boys, intergalactic planetary. If you can go to that level, then that's going to also help. And you'll be able to join us here live to ask your own questions and then share your own comments. And hopefully we'll be able to get Chris on one of these live streams too. But we've got a lot of great people coming forward on these live streams, a lot of great analysis. Let's see. Last question here. Oh, Michelle says, I was hooked after I met you. Thank you so much. Do you hear or see other journalists writing in scientific journals or publications showing an interest in the topic? There is some. I think that they're still digesting all of this information, is how I get it. From the colleagues that I speak to, because I have gotten, as you all have seen, I've gotten to visit some NASA facilities, interview astronauts and the such. Mostly astronauts are pretty skeptical, but there are other science writers who are interested. So for instance, many people think of Jim Oberg, one of the most famous science writers who follows my stuff. Many people see him as a skeptic, and he often jumps in on Open Minds TV or my articles and is, sharing his information, which is sometimes debunking information. But, as he shared with me, he wouldn't be in there. He wouldn't be looking at this stuff if he didn't have an interest. He does have an interest. He's looking for credible information. He's not just looking to poo-poo everything. It's kind of like me. Some people think I'm a debunker because I'll share credible information that may shed light on something being a hoax or otherwise. Sorry, but I just want to share with you all the information I have so you can make an informed decision. He's the same way. There's another gentleman who writes for space.com who I send information to, who is friendly to this topic. There are others. So there are some, they're just kind of sitting back and watching all of this kind of happen. And which is interesting because it's credible stuff. And then there's a few brave people like the Brian Benders or the Tyler Rogaway of the War Zone, part of the Drive website, who are willing to kind of jump head first in and start to really tackle these issues. And it's great because I think the mainstream journalists bring a skill and a discipline to looking into these topics that's very needed. And if they're writing something, it's going to be full of great, credible information, and they are. I think those guys are doing some incredible stuff. Let alone people like Leslie Kane who've been doing it for a long time. But yeah, I think slowly, and I think this process of what Louise and Chris are doing, and what I choose to focus on, is going to help open up even more credible information as far as science writers getting involved with writing about this topic. And organizations like the SCU that I work with, this is the Scientific Coalition for UAP Research. They're gathering quite a few scientists that are interested in all of this, and some of what those scientists have to say is also generating news. And the SCU will be hosting a live stream with Kevin Knuth, an astrophysicist who works at SUNY Albany, who's going to be talking about these topics. And we had another guy who from the same school, I think they're both associate professors, talking about dark matter and UFOs. So if you haven't seen that, go to the SCU YouTube and you'll see those. And I'll post those on my Twitter, and I'll try to share those otherwise. So yeah, things are opening up. But thank you all so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this interview. I think it's full of really great information. I'll be tackling, this interview from different perspectives in future articles. In fact, I'm working on one for Den of Geek that is kind of specifically focused on unidentified, because Den of Geek is all about entertainment and TV. So that's why I'll be focused on that. But even if you look at that, what I'm examining is the influence that unidentified has had on this topic. And I think that's an interesting angle as well. So Jim Stevens, thank you. Guillaume, I'm guessing, Michelle, Adam, Steve, Corey, Josh, Acupunk, all of you who joined in the chat. Thank you so much for joining. Keep an eye on future stuff. We've got lots of great stuff coming up. Tomorrow I'll have another What is Doug Reading, which is just me and my buddy Doug kind of hanging out and being goofy and talking about what esoteric or weird thing he's reading this week. Friday, I'll have another news break. Well, I'll talk about the news from the week and probably a little bit about this. And then next week, we've got some exciting stuff. Most likely, that'll be the week I'll do my interview with Luis Elizondo. So either way, it'll be coming soon. So thank you all so much for participating. Your participation, your comments, your questions are so appreciated. They're intelligent and they're add to the conversation greatly. So I greatly appreciate those. Thank you all so much for joining. And until next time, you all have a wonderful week.